Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. How are you feeling today? I hope you are feeling well and that you were looking forward to this lecture today. Now, if you remember, in the first two lectures, we tried to crack the main economic problem of scarcity. We saw that there were three dimensions to this problem. An economy had to decide what to produce, it had to decide how to produce, and it had to decide for whom to produce. Then we discussed three alternative ways in which this problem could be solved. There was dictatorship, in which only a few people decided the fate of the economy. There was the planned or command economy, in which the government was at the center, and that decided how resources were to be allocated. And then there was the free market economy, which used the price mechanism as the rationing device. Now, we discussed the free market economy in some detail. We saw that in a free market economy, individuals were able to make independent choices. And this raised the question of rational choices and how individuals made rational choices. We also saw that in a free market economy, opportunity costs were important, and that given scarce resources, the increasing opportunity costs of producing one good was what economists were really concerned about. Now, in the second lecture, we developed the concept of opportunity cost and increasing opportunity cost, and we showed how the production possibilities frontier, and to see when the economy was on the PPF, we could demonstrate how producing more of one good implied an increasing opportunity cost in terms of the production of the other good foregone. We also saw that in a free market economy, or generally in any economy, it was important to see that marginal analysis was at the center of decision making and not total analysis. So we saw that economists were interested in marginal benefit and marginal costs, and not total benefit or total costs. And we gave some examples of that. Now, in today's lecture, we are going to develop our understanding of the free market economy a little bit more. We're going to see what are the ethical implications of subscribing to the free market economy notion or the capitalist economy. We'll also see how once we have developed an understanding of the free market economy, we can stab into our analysis of demand, supply, and equilibrium in such an economy. So let's start by understanding the free market economy a little bit better, by understanding the final two components of such an economy. Now, if you recall, we saw that the free market economy had the price mechanism at the heart of it as the rationing device. And we also saw that a free market economy gave individuals the freedom to make independent choices. But the two things that we did not talk about in our previous lecture was that a free market economy characterizes individuals as selfish. So households are characterized as utility maximizers, firms are characterized as profit maximizers, and owners of economic resources, that is land, labor, and capital, are characterized as people wanting to sell their economic resources at the highest possible price. Now, this assumption that individuals are selfish has very important ethical implications. Some people might feel that this is not a good assumption to make. Why should we portray people as selfish? And that maybe some other assumption is better. Now, another assumption about how individuals should be characterized is that of altruistic preferences. What this assumption basically says is that individuals mainly worry about other people's benefits and other people's interests, more so than their own benefit or interests. And the example usually given is that of a mother, that a mother might be willing to sacrifice her own life in the interests of the child. So in that particular case, the child's interest is more important for the mother than her own. And so people say that it's important to recognize such altruistic preferences and incorporate them in economic analysis. However, economists argue that on average, the assumption that individuals pursue their own self-interest, their own selfish gain, is a safer assumption to make, and that on average it is not common for people to be more caring about other people's preferences or other people's benefits. And so the idea has gradually become accepted that individuals should be seen as selfish. Now, the ethical dimensions of this are very serious. Some people argue that by taking individuals as selfish, you're promoting greed in society, or materialism, or encouraging people to get involved in self-seeking behavior. And this is not the hallmark of a good society. But economists then argue that it is possible that by pursuing individuals' selfish interests, individuals actually obtain a state in which the society also reaches an optimal state. So it is possible for individual self-pursuit or selfish pursuit of goals at the individual level to lead to societal good or a social optimum. Now, in order for this to hold, that is, individual pursuit of selfish interests translating into societal good, there are two major assumptions that go into this. One is that of perfect competition, and the other is that of the price mechanism. So if the price mechanism works well, then there are chances that individual interests will translate into society's overall best interests. But more importantly, if there is not enough competition in the economy, not enough competition between firms, it is possible that individual interests do not translate fully into societal good. Now, in order to bring out the importance of these two assumptions, let's illustrate through the interdependence of different markets. So we'll talk about the dependence between the goods market and the dependence of that and the factor markets. And we'll see that the dependence can be two-way. So the goods markets can be dependent on factor markets, and factor markets can be dependent on goods markets. And through this discussion, we'll see whether individual interests do actually translate into societal good. Let's go to our first slide. Now let's take the example of the market for bicycles. So B here in this slide refers to bicycles. D stands for demand, S stands for supply, P stands for price, and then L stands for labor, and yeah, that summarizes the notation. So let's see what happens if there is an increase in the demand for bicycles by individuals. And now we are going to see whether this increase in the demand for bicycles by individuals actually translates into a situation in which their demands are met by society or not. So when the demand for bicycles goes up, a shortage exists in the market. A shortage is basically defined as a situation in which the demand for something exceeds its supply. So if demand goes up arbitrarily, then given the supply, the starting level of the good supply, there will be a shortage. DB will be greater than SB. Now this shortage will cause an upward pressure to be exerted on the price of bicycles, right? So the prices of bicycles will go up. The prices of bicycles will go up, and this will cause the supply of bicycles to go up. Why will the supply of bicycles go up? Because producers will feel that they have more profit to make in the production of bicycles. But the increase in the price of bicycles will cause the demand for bicycles to go down, because bicycles are now more expensive. Now this process will keep going on until the demand of bicycles is brought equal to the supply of bicycles. In other words, until equilibrium is restored. Now let's see what is happening in the labor market. Now as you can see in this example, the individual's greater demand for bicycles was met by an increase in the supply of bicycles by firms. And this is how the price mechanism and competition between firms establishes the principle that individual gains or individual desires translate into societal good. Another important point that this slide helps illustrate is the interdependence between the goods market and the factor market. Now let's look at what are the implications of all this process above in the bicycles markets for the market for labor. Now as you know, labor, capital, land, these are the economic factors which are used in the production of any good. Now let's assume that labor is used most intensively in the production of bicycles. That is, bicycles use 20 units of capital and then 80 units of labor and then let's say 10 units of land. So labor is used most intensively. What will happen when the price of bicycles goes up and the supply of bicycles goes up as a result? Now as firms try to increase the supply of bicycles, they will need to hire more labor. This will bid up the demand for labor. Now as the demand for labor goes up, there will be a shortage in the labor market because DL will be greater than SL. This will cause the price of labor to go up. Now as the price of labor goes up, the supply of labor will increase. People will be more willing to work because the wage rate has now gone up. On the other hand, firms' demand for labor will go down because the price of labor, that is the wage rate, has become higher. Now this process will continue and the price of labor will continue to rise until DL equals SL and equilibrium is restored in the labor market. Now this interdependence in the goods and factor markets that we've just illustrated exists in the opposite direction as well, so that changes in the factor market can also affect the goods market. Now let's see what happens in this example in which we have the market for cars below. So the cars here are the goods that we are talking about. And in the factor market, we're talking about iron, which is used in the manufacturing of cars. Let's now assume that the supply of iron suddenly goes up. This could be, let's say, due to a discovery of iron ore in the country. What happens? When the supply of iron goes up, there will be a surplus in the market for iron. Demand for iron will be less than the supply for iron. And therefore, there will be a downward pressure exerted on the price of iron. This will cause the demand for iron to go up while the supply of iron to go down until Di is equal to Si. Note, however, that this will only happen, that is, the price of iron will only go down if there is perfect competition between firms. If, for example, there is just one firm which controls the supply of iron, it might decide not to lower the price of iron despite an increase in its supply. So this is where the perfect competition assumption comes into play. Now let's see what's happening in the cars market. Now due to a reduction in the price of iron, which is an important input in the production of cars, producers of cars will be able to produce more cars or will be able to produce cars more cheaply. This will mean an increase in the supply of cars, and therefore a surplus will be created in the car market. That is, DC will be less than SC. This will exert downward pressure on the prices of cars, and this in turn will cause the demand for cars to go up and the supply of cars to go down until DC is equal to SC. So this was an example of how factor markets affect goods markets. So my dear friends, through that example we saw how the goods and factor markets could be interdependent. Now it is also possible for different goods markets to be interdependent. So you could think of the example in which the market for bicycles or the market for motorcycles is dependent on what happens in the market for cars. So if the price of, let's say, motorcycles goes down, then some people who were on the verge of deciding as to whether they should buy motorcycles or cars might decide in favor of buying motorcycles, and therefore that might cause a reduction in the demand for cars and therefore might produce a surplus in the car market. So it is possible for different goods markets, especially when the goods are substitutes, to be interdependent. Similarly, it is possible for factor markets to be dependent as well. So the labor market could be dependent on the capital market. I'll leave it up to you to think of an example of how that could come about. Now, in examining these examples, we've seen the importance of the price mechanism, how it responds to shortages and surpluses, and we've also seen the importance of the assumption of competition between firms. Now, in reality, the assumption about competition is a very suspect one, and we see that in the real world there are firms which control the supply of certain goods, of certain resources, and they exercise their control, they exercise the power that that control gives them to manipulate prices up and down. Some firms who have a lot of money can use advertising dollars or advertising money to change consumer preferences. These are all examples when individual preferences of consumers might not fully translate into societal good. That is, firms might not fully respond to consumers' wishes. For all these reasons, and for a number of other reasons that we will discuss later, most economies, most market economies that we see around us are not pure market economies. They are, in fact, mixed economies. So they have features of both the planned economy and the free market economy. So when we are talking about comparing the benefits of the market economy versus the command economy, in reality, we are basically comparing the costs and benefits of economies which lean towards the free market and economies which lean towards the command economy. We are not really talking about a comparison of the two poles because they really don't exist in the real world. Now, given our slightly better understanding of the free market economy, let's stab into the heart of economics, which is demand and supply analysis. This is the first topic that we will tackle in microeconomics, and we will discuss it in the context of a free market economy. So let's start by looking at what demand is. Now, as we've talked in the context of shortages and surpluses, you know that when the price of a good increases, the demand for that good falls. So that the price effect of any good is negative. What this basically means is that as the price of a particular good increases, the expenditure, the consumption of that good falls. Now, there is no rocket science about it. This is common knowledge. Everybody knows this. Everybody practices this. So you might be wondering, why am I repeating it so many times? Well, the important thing to note here is that economists have dug deeper and understood really why consumption on a good falls when the price of that good rises, and vice versa. So economists have formalized this law of demand in the context of income and substitution effects. Now, in order to fully understand these, let's go to a slide. Now, the price effect can first of all be summarized as the law of demand, which basically says that as the price of a good increases, its quantity demanded falls. Now, note here that the quantity demanded does not refer to potential quantity demanded, but to actual quantity demanded. So, for example, if the price of Mercedes-Benz cars increases, your potential demand for Mercedes-Benz cars might still be very high, but the actual amount that you will spend on Mercedes-Benz cars will probably only be equal to zero because you're still first-year undergraduates. So when we talk about quantity demanded, we refer to the actual expenditure consumers are willing to make on a particular product. So now, given that better understanding of the price effect, let's see how it can be split into income and substitution effects. Now, as you can see here, the income effect is basically the effect of a change in price on quantity demanded arising from the consumer becoming better or worse off as a result of the price change. Whereas the substitution effect is the effect of a change in price on quantity demanded arising from the consumer switching to or from alternative products, which can be called substitutes. Now let's look at an example through which we will illustrate the income effect. Let's say we have a rational consumer who is faced with the decision to buy wheat or rice using rupees 100. So he can either spend his money on the purchase of wheat or on the purchase of rice. Let's say the price of wheat in the market is rupees 15 per kg and the price of rice is rupees 5 per kg. So he can technically use his rupees 100 to buy 6.6 kg of wheat or 20 kg of rice. But in the actual scenario, let's see he buys 4 kg of wheat, so that he spends rupees 60 on wheat, and he buys 8 kg of rice, that is, he spends rupees 40 on rice. This will totally exhaust his income of rupees 100. Now, if you notice carefully, the ratio of wheat consumption to rice consumption is 1:2. That is, for 4 kg of wheat, the consumer consumes 8 kg of rice. Now, in order to illustrate the income effect of a price increase, let's assume that the price of wheat now rises from rupees 15 to rupees 20 per kg. Now, given his rupees 100, he can either buy 5 kg of wheat or 20 kg of rice. If he wants to still consume 4 kg of wheat, the question that arises is that can he still maintain the consumption ratio of 1:2? That is, can he still consume 8 kg of rice? You will say no, because with the amount of money that he has, if he spends 4 kg or if he consumes 4 kg of wheat, he will only have 20 rupees left, from which he can buy only 4 kg of rice. Now, this failure to be able to consume the same quantity of goods as the consumer could earlier consume is attributable to the income effect. That is, his real income has fallen. His ability or his purchasing power has gone down. When we say that the income effect is negative, what we mean is that as the price of a good increases, the consumer's purchasing power or income falls, and because his income falls, his consumption of a particular good falls as well. So in this example, it is most likely that the consumer will reduce his consumption both of wheat and of rice. So he might consume in reality something like 3 kg of wheat and spend the remaining on rice, or something like 3.5 kg of wheat and the remaining money on rice. Now, it is important to differentiate between two types of goods here: normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are those goods where the relationship between income and consumption is positive, so that if income increases, the consumption of the good increases. If income falls, the consumption of the good falls. Inferior goods, on the other hand, are goods where the relationship between income and consumption is negative, so that if your income goes up, you will consume less of the good. Let's illustrate this through the example of butter and margarine. Now, margarine is an inferior substitute for butter. So if a household or if a person becomes richer, that is, his income goes up, he might reduce his expenditure on margarine and spend more on the better quality product, that is, butter. So this is an example of an inferior good. Please note that when we said in the beginning that the income effect for a normal good is negative, this does not mean that the effect of higher income on the consumption of that good is negative. No, a normal good like butter has a relationship between income and consumption that is positive, not negative. What we mean by saying that the income effect is negative is that the income effect induced by a price increase and the effect of this on the consumption of the good is negative. Now let's look at what substitution effect is. Substitution effect can be illustrated by assuming that the consumer retains rupees 60 as expenditure on wheat. Now, if he still spends rupees 40 on rice, what is the ratio of the quantities he is now consuming? The ratio is no longer 1:2. The ratio is now 3:8. That is, he consumes 3 kilograms of wheat and 8 kilograms of rice. The ratio has gone down and in favor of rice. This means that the consumer has substituted some of his wheat consumption for rice consumption. That is, he has replaced some of his wheat consumption by rice consumption. The substitution effect, therefore, of any good is negative. Whenever the price of a particular good goes up, people will stop or reduce consumption of that good in favor of consuming some other substitute or alternative. Now, combining the income and the substitution effects, we get the price effect. Now, as you know, the income effect for a normal good is negative, and the substitution effect for any good is negative. So that the price effect of a normal good is unambiguously negative, and this is what the law of demand says as well. However, if we are talking about an inferior good, it is possible for the income effect and the substitution effect to combine to give a positive price effect. That is, if the income effect is sufficiently positive, it can overturn the negative substitution effect to bring about a positive price effect. So that in that case, when the price of a particular good increases, its quantity demanded will also increase. Goods such as this are special categories of inferior goods, and they are called Giffen goods. We will illustrate income and substitution effects in greater detail when we discuss utility theory. Now, I don't know whether that discussion of income and substitution effects has improved your understanding of the relationship between quantity demanded and price. But if it hasn't, then don't panic. We will review this later in utility theory. And I would also suggest that you look at the text on this and the questions that have been put up for you on the web, and they will help clarify your concepts. So now that we have an understanding of why the law of demand is what it is, let's see if we can formulate a demand curve or a demand schedule and relate price and quantity demanded either in tabular form or in graphical form. So we developed the notion of demand schedules and demand curves. Demand schedules are basically tables in which you have a column in which different prices are given and a column in which different quantities are given. You could have it for the individual or you could have it for the whole market. Similarly, you could draw these or plot these figures onto a graph in price-quantity space. So price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and then you would get a negatively sloping demand curve. Let's see how this obtains through the use of an example. Let's go to our slide. Now here we have a table in which the price of corn per bushel is related to the quantity demanded of corn by one individual and then the quantity demanded of corn by the whole of the market. We assume that there are 1,000 similar or identical individuals in the market. So let's see, for example, at the price of $5 per bushel, the quantity demanded by any one individual is 3.5 bushels per month. Per month here stresses the fact that this is quantity demanded, that is actual quantity demanded and not potential quantity demanded, which could be unlimited. So at a price of $5 per bushel, the quantity demanded is 3.5, whereas the quantity demanded in the market as a whole is 3,500, which is simply 3.5 multiplied by 1,000, or 3.5 added 1,000 times. Now, as we go down the price column, as the price falls from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, we see that the quantity demanded gradually increases from 3.5 to 4.5 to 6 to 8 to 11. And this establishes the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Similarly, the quantity demanded in the market also, which is simply a multiple by 1,000 of the quantity demanded by an individual, rises as well as the price falls. So at $5, we have 3,500 bushels demanded in the market, whereas at $1, we have 11,000 bushels demanded in the market. Now, if we plot these figures onto a graph, we'll get the individual and the market demand curves. The individual demand curve is shown as Q, small q, whereas the market demand curve is shown with the bigger Q. Now, as you can see, the small q, the individual demand curve, is a downward sloping curve. And if we aggregate it across 1,000 individuals, we get the market demand curve. Once we have the market demand curve, we can now talk about shifts in this demand curve and movements along the demand curve. Now, this is a very important distinction. Shifts in the demand curve mean that when a factor other than price changes, the demand curve has to be redrawn. And usually it involves shifting the demand curve either to the right or the left. So you redraw the demand curve either to the right of the original demand curve or to its left. Movements along the demand curve happen when we are talking about changes in the price of the good, which is already shown on the vertical axis. So if there is a change in the variable shown on the vertical axis, which is price in this case, we are talking about movements along the demand curve. But if we are talking about some other determinant of demand which changes, then we are talking about shifts in the demand curve. Since this is a very important point, let's clarify it further through another graphical illustration. Now, if you look at this graph, you'll see that we have plotted on the left-hand side a graph of income against quantity demanded. Now, income is also a determinant of demand. As your income increases, your demand for a particular product increases because your purchasing power increases. Therefore, the demand curve is now upward sloping. Now, a movement along the demand curve would be caused by a rise in income, right? However, a shift in the demand curve would be caused by a change in any other factor than income. So if any other determinant of demand, let's say the price of the good, increases or decreases, the demand curve would shift. So if the price decreased, there would be a rightward shift in the demand curve, because at any level of income, consumers would want to demand more of the commodity. On the right-hand side, you have the familiar price-quantity graph in which we have a downward sloping demand curve. As we move down the demand curve from a northwesterly position to a southeasterly position, price falls and quantity rises. However, if we now want to evaluate what the impact would be of an increase in income on this graph, we need to talk about a shift in the demand curve. Essentially, we redraw a new demand curve to the right of the original demand curve. So whenever a factor other than that shown on the vertical axis changes, we are talking about shifts in the demand curve. Whenever there is a change in the factor already shown on the vertical axis, we are talking about movements along the demand curve. Now that we understand why a demand curve could shift, let's see what the factors are, the different determinants of demand are that could cause these shifts. So basically, we'll take the PQ space as our starting point, so the price quantity space as our starting point, We have a downward sloping demand curve, and we'll see what other factors can cause this particular curve to shift either to the right or to the left. Now, economists have identified at least 6 variables which affect the position of the demand curve. The first one is, of course, income. As your income goes up, the quantity demanded of the good will go up because you can now consume more. You can now purchase more of the good. Another variable that affects the position of the demand curve is tastes. As your taste for a particular product increases, you would consume more of it. So, for example, suddenly, if consumers wanted to improve their health and consume more butter, they would increase their consumption of butter. Tastes can be affected by advertising as well. So, many firms try to affect consumer tastes through advertising expenditures. Then we also have the prices of complementary products. Complementary products are products that go together. So we have matches and cigarettes, bread and butter, bat and ball, salt and food or curry that is cooked. All these are examples of complementary products. The key feature here is that as the price of one of these groups or one of these products is increased, the quantity demanded of the other also falls. So if the price of cigarettes goes up, then people who buy matches to light the cigarettes will also now buy fewer matches because they are now buying fewer cigarettes. Similarly, if the price of butter went up, then consumers might want to consume less bread as well, because earlier they used bread to go to eat with the butter, but now because they're reducing their consumption on butter, they might reduce their consumption of bread as well. Another factor that economists have identified is the price of substitute goods. Now, in our previous example of wheat and rice, we saw that there were 2 substitutes. People can either eat wheat or chapatis in the evening or in the afternoon, or they can consume rice. Now, it is important to see whether the substitutes are close or distant. The closer the substitutes, the more will the impact of the increase or decrease in the price of the substitute be on the quantity demanded of the other good. So, for example, if wheat and rice are considered to be very close substitutes by one household, an increase in the price of wheat will be compensated by an increase in the quantity demanded for rice fully. However, if wheat and rice are imperfect substitutes for another household, then an increase in the price of wheat might not be compensated by an increase in the quantity demanded of rice to the full extent. Another example of close substitutes is butter and margarine, and we used this example earlier. Another factor that economists have identified is income distribution. So if the income is distributed in an economy from the rich to the poor, what impact will it have on the demand for various products? The argument here is that if income is distributed from the rich to the poor, then the demand for luxury goods and the demand for inferior goods will both go down. The demand for luxury goods will go down because the rich are no longer as rich. And the demand for inferior goods will go down because the poor have now more money and they can buy better quality products. If the income is distributed from the poor to the rich, unfortunately, then the demand for luxury goods will increase and the demand for inferior goods will also increase. The first will increase because the rich are now richer, they have more money to spend, and they have a natural preference for luxury goods, whereas the demand for inferior goods will increase because the poor have now less money and therefore will have to buy more of the inferior products. Finally, demand depends on future prices of commodities. If the price of a commodity is expected to rise in the near future, then consumers would like to buy a lot of that commodity today and then stock it up so that they don't have to buy a lot of that commodity in the future at the higher price. If, however, the price of a particular product is expected to fall in the future, then consumers will defer their expenditure today and wait for the price to actually fall and then consume it at that later date. So all these factors, changes in all these factors will cause shifts in the demand curve. An increase in income will cause the demand curve to shift to the right. A decrease in tastes will cause the demand curve to shift to the left. An increase in the price of complementary goods will cause the demand curve to shift to the left. A decrease in the price of substitute goods will cause the demand curve to shift to the left. An increase in the income held by poor will lead to the demand of inferior products and luxury products going down. So the demand curve for inferior and luxury products would both shift to the left. And an increase in expected prices of goods will mean that the demand curve will shift to the right as consumers will attempt to buy more of the product today. Now there we saw how demand and price relationships could be presented in the form of demand schedules and in the form of graphs or demand curves. However, demand and price relationships and the relationship of demand with some of its other determinants can also be presented in the form of demand functions. Demand functions are basically like equations. So you have the quantity demanded on the left-hand side of the equation and a function of all the other determinants on the right-hand side. So let's go to a slide to illustrate what a typical demand function would look like. Let's go to our slide. Now here we have the simplest form of a demand function. We have QD on the left-hand side of the equation, and it is equal to f, where f is a function of PG, T, PSI to PSN, PCI to PCM, Y, B, PGE, T plus 1, where these terms mean as follows. PG is the price of the good, T stands for tastes, PSI to PSN are the price of substitute goods, PCI to PCM are the prices of complementary goods, Y stands for income, B stands for income distribution, and PGE T plus 1 stands for the future movements in prices. Now sometimes it is not possible to write down these complex demand functions with all the variables in there. For example, it might be very difficult to put values for income distribution or tastes or future prices. So sometimes economists present these demand functions as bivariate functions, so that you have just one variable on the right-hand side. Equation 1 is an example of one such bivariate function. We have QD is equal to A minus BP. Now putting values for A and B, which are usually estimated from regression analysis, which is beyond the scope of this course, we have equation 2, which would be QD is equal to 10,000 minus 200 P. Now if we plot it in QD and P space, we can generate the demand curve as B, where the demand curve intersects the Q axis at 10,000 and intersects the P axis at 50. Now if you are intelligent, you must have spotted that we are drawing this curve in QP space and not in the familiar PQ space. Now this is an important distinction. Technically, I think we should have always drawn demand curves in QP space, because Q is the dependent variable and P is the variable which causes changes in the dependent variable. However, by convention, and also because we are usually interested in the changes to equilibrium price, we draw demand curves in PQ space instead of QP space. So if we plot this same function in PQ space, we see that on the vertical axis we have the curve intersecting price at 50, and on the horizontal axis intersecting that axis at 10,000. Now shifts in the demand curve B prime will be caused by changes in the value of this figure 10,000. If 10,000 increases to, let's say, 12,000, we'll move to C, which is to the right of B. If 10,000 falls to 8,000, we'll move to the left of B prime to A prime, where the price now intersects at 40. Now I will leave it to you to see how you can draw or how you can come up with demand functions in QY space so that you have quantity demanded on the vertical axis and income of consumers on the horizontal axis. So try to draw your demand function, which might take the shape of QD is equal to A plus BY, both in QY space and in YQ space. Technically, you should try to draw it in YQ space because by convention we have quantity on the horizontal axis as mentioned earlier. So with that, my friends, you should now be comfortable with both equational or algebraic representations of demand and graphical illustrations of demand. We've seen examples of both. We've seen how demand functions can be written as equations like QD is equal to A minus BP or QD is equal to A plus BY, and we drew demand curves in PQ, QP, IQ and QI spaces. Now let's try to sum up on what we've learned today. We started with a discussion of the free market economy, and we saw that a free market economy characterizes individuals as selfish. So households were seen as utility maximizers, firms were seen as profit maximizers, and owners of economic resources were seen as trying to obtain the maximum price at which they could sell or offer their resources, that is land, labor, and capital. We saw that there were ethical implications of this assumption that individuals were selfish. And the ethical implication was that the society as a whole could become susceptible to greed and materialism and self-seeking behavior if individuals were seen as purely selfish. However, we saw that economists were in favor of this argument because often this was a better argument to make, better assumption to make than that of altruistic preferences, that individuals care more about other people's benefits than their own. And they felt that on average that was not true. More importantly, economists said that by keeping the assumption of selfish individuals, you do not jeopardize the overall societal good, and that can still obtain with individuals which are self-seeking or who pursue their selfish interests. Then we illustrated how individual desires or individual wants could translate into the social good through the workings of the price mechanism and the coming in of competition between firms. However, we also saw that if this competition broke down, and if there was just, let's say, one or two large firms controlling the supply of certain goods, then it was possible for consumer wants to be not fully translated into the decisions of producers that the consumers would want them to make. We also saw how different markets were interdependent. We saw how goods markets and factor markets interacted, how changes in the demand for a good affected changes in the demands for factors which were used intensively in the production of that good. We also saw a case of reverse causation, in which changes in the demand or a supply of a factor affected changes in the demand or supply of goods which used that factor. Then we launched into a detailed study of demand. We saw what shortages and surpluses were. We saw how shortages and surpluses affected prices. We saw what the law of demand was, how it could be divided into substitution and income effects. That is, what was the effect of a price increase on the purchasing power of a person, and how that affected his decision to consume more or less of a particular commodity. We also saw that the substitution effect consisted in the effect of a price rise on the preference of a consumer for substitute products which are probably still cheaper. So if the price of, let's say, margarine went up, consumers might shift to consuming more butter. We gave the example of complementary goods as well. We said that complementary goods were goods that went together. So matches and cigarettes was an example. Fuel and cars are a good example as well. If the price of fuel goes up, consumers might switch to public transport rather than driving their own cars, which consumes a lot of petrol. Now, in this discussion of substitute goods and complementary goods, we talked about shifts in demand curves, especially market demand curves, which we had learned to draw through market and individual demand schedules. And we saw that shifts in the demand curve were caused by changes in factors which were not shown on the vertical axis. On the other hand, movements along the demand curve were caused by changes in the factor which was shown on the vertical axis. So if we were drawing the demand curve in PQ space, then movements down the demand curve or up the demand curve would be caused by changes in price, which is shown on the vertical axis. On the other hand, if we were drawing the demand curve in IQ space, that is income quantity space, then that would be an upward sloping demand curve, and then movements up or down the demand curve would be caused by changes in the income level of individuals. And then finally, we discussed demand functions, which I just summed up before I began the broader sum up. So that, my friends, basically concludes today's lecture. In tomorrow's lecture, we'll look at supply. And then later on, once we've combined our understanding of supply and demand, we'll look at equilibrium analysis. Let me warn you that with these lectures, we are now gradually moving closer and closer to the heart of economics. It is very important for you to understand these concepts of demand and supply fully. And in order to do that, I would suggest go home and practice some of the questions that have been put up on the web for you. By attempting those questions, you will develop a familiarity with the notation used, the graphical illustrations, and this will mean that once you see these questions in exams, you're more likely to get them right. So with that note, I say Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.